The man remembered by history as the dreaded pirate captain Blackbeard remains an enigma wrapped in both fact and legend. His true origins have been debated for centuries, and no single account provides certainty. Early records from the 18th century refer to him as Edward Teach, Edward Tatch, or similar variations. Yet even this information is clouded in doubt, for sailors of the age often concealed themselves behind false names, aliases that shielded their families from shame, while protecting their own reputations, in a world where piracy and privateering overlapped. One of the most persistent traditions places his birth in the bustling port city of Bristol, southwest England, around 1680. A contemporary document even describes him as a man born in Bristol. At the time, Bristol was the second largest port in England, a hub of transatlantic trade, and a breeding ground for sailors who would become merchants, naval officers, or in rare cases, infamous pirates. It was a city alive with opportunity and with temptation. But Bristol is not the only candidate. Some records claim he first drew breath in Jamaica, citing him as a native of Jamaica, of very creditable parents. Another theory, drawn from a later publication, suggests that he was not English-born at all, but a North Carolinian named Edward Beard. Historians have wrestled with these claims, but without decisive proof, each theory only adds another layer of mystery to the man who would terrorize the seas. The one point of general agreement is his birth period. Most accounts describe him as being in his mid-30s by the mid-1710s, placing his year of birth around 1680. Whether he came from the narrow streets of Bristol, the plantations of Jamaica, or the rugged coastlines of North Carolina, he entered a world in flux. The British Empire was expanding, colonization efforts were accelerating, and the Atlantic had become the great stage of ambition, conflict, and conquest. And yet, the historical record is only half the story. Folklore whispered something darker. Legends claimed that Edward Teach was no ordinary child, but one born under a cursed star. Some said that a comet blazed in the night sky on the night of his birth, a fiery omen that marked him as destined for infamy. Others believed his mother was a witch, and that her whispers followed him to sea, protecting him from death until his fated final battle. Such tales, while fantastical, stuck fast in the cultural imagination. They painted a picture of a man not merely mortal, but touched by forces beyond comprehension. Even before he commanded his first ship, Blackbeard was already being shaped by rumour, fear, and myth into something more than human, an omen of terror upon the waters. Before we continue, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It's a simple way to support, and I'd love to know in the comments where in the world and at what time you're listening tonight. By the dawn of the 17th century, England had finally entered the race for empire. Spain and Portugal had already carved vast dominions across the Americas, while France and the Dutch Republic competed for their share of wealth. England, once late to the game, was now pressing forward with colonies in Virginia and Massachusetts, and soon Caribbean outposts like Barbados and Jamaica. The Atlantic had become a chessboard of nations, each vying for supremacy. It was in this charged, dangerous world that Edward Teach Blackbeard came of age. Whether born in Bristol's crowded alleys, Jamaica's sugar-scented air, or Carolina's wild coast, he was destined to ride the rising tide of empire. But unlike most men of his generation, he would not become a planter, a merchant, or even a soldier. Instead, he would carve a name so fearsome that centuries later, the very mention of it, Blackbeard, would still send a shiver down the spine. By the late 1600s and early 1700s, England had transformed itself into a rising imperial power, extending its influence across the Atlantic. The nation that had once lagged behind Spain and Portugal in overseas expansion was now rapidly establishing colonies and strengthening its naval presence. The foundation of Virginia and Massachusetts in the early 1600s had set the stage, but by the mid-17th century, England's reach stretched far wider. Barbados, Bermuda, Jamaica, and other Caribbean islands became jewels of its growing empire, each one a strategic foothold in a vast and contested ocean. Jamaica in particular proved pivotal. Taken from Spain in 1655 during Oliver Cromwell's Western design, the island quickly became both a plantation economy and a staging ground for English naval operations. Its bustling port at Port Royal soon earned a reputation as the wickedest city on earth, a haven for sailors, merchants, and privateers. For men like Edward Teach, this was a world of opportunity. A young sailor could find work on merchant vessels, warships, or in the shadows of privateering, where the line between legitimacy and piracy was paper-thin. Trade surged across the Atlantic, fueled by sugar, tobacco, and the brutal traffic of enslaved Africans. Ships carrying these commodities made tempting targets for raiders. Pirates flourished because the oceans had become both highways of empire and hunting grounds of desperation, and while governments officially condemned piracy, they often looked the other way, or even encouraged it when it served their national interests. The concept of the privateer blurred these lines. These were captains licensed by governments to raid enemy ships during times of war. Men like Sir Francis Drake had set the precedent a century earlier, attacking Spanish treasure fleets with the blessing of Queen Elizabeth I. To their patrons, they were heroes. To their victims, they were nothing but pirates cloaked in legality. The distinction was often meaningless at sea, and it was in this murky space that Edward Teach would one day rise. During the 17th century, pirate activity shifted westward. Early raiders had prowled the northern Atlantic, striking from Ireland, England's West Country, and even North Africa. But as colonies multiplied in the Caribbean and along the American coast, the pirates followed. By the late 1000, 600 second strongholds, like Tortuga, New Providence in the Bahamas and Port Royal, had become notorious havens. Here law was thin, loyalty was negotiable, and a man's worth was measured by his courage and ruthlessness. The Atlantic world was alive with conflict. England and the Dutch Republic clashed in a series of naval wars, while France and Spain fought to protect their colonies. Every major European power sought to dominate the seas. Each war created opportunities for seafarers, letters of marque handed to privateers who turned their guns on rival nations' ships. And when peace treaties were signed, thousands of these men suddenly found themselves without employment, drifting into outright piracy. This was the world into which Edward Teach stepped as a young sailor. Whether he began in Bristol, Jamaica, or Carolina, his formative years coincided with an age of upheaval. Ships were everywhere laden with good soldiers and wealth. Empires competed with each other, and in their wake a generation of hardened seamen learned the art of war, survival, and plunder. Folklore suggests that Teach, even as a youth, had an unsettling aura about him. One story claims that he was drawn to the ocean, not for trade or duty, but for something darker that he believed the sea itself called to him. Sailors whispered that certain men were marked by Neptune, destined for either greatness or damnation upon the waves. Whether superstition or truth, it fit the legend that would later grow. Edward Teach was never meant to be ordinary. By the early 1702, with England at war again in Europe and across the Atlantic, the stage was set. Colonial wealth flowed in endless convoys, and pirates lurked in the shadows, waiting to strike. Among them would emerge a captain unlike any other one, who used not only cannon and cutlass but fear itself as a weapon. His name was about to become the most dreaded in the Atlantic. The term pirate might seem simple to modern ears, conjuring images of lawless men who robbed and killed on the high seas. But in the early modern world, the reality was far more complicated. Two distinct categories existed, though both are remembered today under the same word. One was the privateer, a captain operating with a license sanctioned by a government to attack the ships of rival nations. The other was the pirate proper, beholden to no king, queen, or law, living outside every system of legitimacy. Privateers were not only tolerated but celebrated. They were given documents known as letters of marque, which authorized them to prey upon enemy commerce. The monarchs who issued these papers had plausible deniability if captured. The privateer could present his license as proof that he was acting in the name of his nation. If the political winds shifted, governments could claim ignorance and distance themselves from the very men they once empowered. To the privateer, this arrangement offered protection, legitimacy, and often national glory. To their enemies, they were indistinguishable from brigands. This uneasy system produced figures like Sir Francis Drake in the 16th century, hailed in England as a hero while cursed in Spain as a ruthless thief. By the 17th century, dozens of men carried on this tradition, operating out of ports like Jamaica and Barbados. They struck Spanish treasure fleets in the Caribbean, harassed French shipping, and returned home with cargoes of gold, silver, sugar, and rum. In London, they were toasted as patriots. In Madrid, they were branded criminals. But the system contained a fatal flaw: it depended entirely on war. When peace was declared, privateers were left unemployed. Their ships, crews, and experience did not simply vanish. Many faced with poverty continued their trade without authorization, transforming from licensed privateers into outright pirates. For them, the difference between legality and criminality was little more than ink on paper. By the late 1600s and early 1700s, this cycle had become a defining feature of the Atlantic world. Wars created opportunities. Peace created pirates. The English crown knew this, but often preferred the convenience. Why maintain a costly navy when hungry seamen could do the job at their own expense, as long as they received a document and the promise of spoils? It was cheaper, faster, and often more effective. This grey zone was precisely where men like Edward Teach were shaped. Though we know little of his youth, the circumstances suggest he may have served on a privateer vessel during the War of the Spanish Succession. Many later pirates did. In that conflict, which erupted after the death of Spain's king in 1700, England and France clashed across Europe and the Americas. The Caribbean seethed with naval battles, and privateers swarmed the sea lanes. If Teach indeed served in these waters, it would explain both his seamanship and his fearlessness. He would have learned to maneuver ships under fire, to board and overwhelm enemy crews, and to navigate the treacherous currents of the Caribbean. Such training could only be acquired in battle, and it would serve him well when he stepped into the world of piracy. At the same time, myths began to form around him. Some claimed he always favoured boldness over caution, even in his earliest days at sea. A legend whispered that once, while still a common sailor, he volunteered to swim through shark-infested waters to retrieve a lost rope, a feat so reckless that his shipmates began calling him the man who feared nothing. Whether true or not, it captured the essence of his legend. Edward Teach was destined to inspire terror not only in his enemies, but in those who sailed beside him. The distinction between privateer and pirate may seem clear in theory, but in practice the two were nearly indistinguishable. When Edward Teach emerged as Blackbeard, he would embody this duality: part patriot, part outlaw, a man forged in the sanctioned violence of empire and the unsanctioned violence of piracy. The age had given him both opportunity and excuse. Now he would take them further than anyone else dared. As the 17th century drew to a close, piracy found fertile soil in the waters of the Caribbean and the Western Atlantic. Colonies were spreading, trade routes were thriving, and the flow of wealth across the ocean created irresistible opportunities. Ports that were meant to be outposts of empire instead became crucibles of lawlessness, where men without nations carved out their own kingdoms of plunder. The geography of the Caribbean itself seemed to conspire with the pirates' cause. Scattered islands, shallow banks, and hidden coves offered safe anchorages and ambush points. Large naval vessels could not easily navigate these waters, but smaller pirate sloops could dart in and out with ease. From these natural fortresses, the pirates struck at ships laden with sugar, tobacco, indigo, and rum. To the merchants of Europe, the sea became a gauntlet of danger. Among the most infamous havens was Port Royal, Jamaica. Once a proud English colony, it quickly gained notoriety as the wickedest city on earth. Taverns spilled rum by the barrel, and brothels welcomed men with pockets full of stolen silver. Their privateers and pirates mingled freely with colonial officials, the line between legitimacy and criminality dissolving in drunken laughter. Some governors openly profited from the pirate trade, turning a blind eye so long as their share was secured. But Port Royal was not alone. Tortuga, off the coast of Hispaniola, became legendary as a pirate republic, while Nassau, on New Providence, in the Bahamas, earned the title of a true pirate capital. Nassau in particular thrived after the War of the Spanish Succession, when disbanded privateers sought refuge. Here pirate crews ruled the harbour, their flags flying brazenly as if mocking the crowns of Europe. Merchants who ventured too close often found themselves stripped of their cargo or of their ships entirely. These havens were more than dens of thieves. They were places where pirate society flourished. Crews drafted their own codes of conduct, dividing plunder according to agreed shares. Captains could be elected and deposed by vote. For sailors accustomed to the rigid hierarchies of naval service, this rough democracy was intoxicating. In a world where kings and governors held absolute power, pirates offered a glimpse of radical equality, albeit one soaked in blood and rum. Edward Teach would have known these ports well. If his early years were spent as a privateer or common sailor, he would have walked the streets of Port Royal. He'd seen the taverns of Nassau, and perhaps even sworn his first oaths under the makeshift codes of brotherhood that bound crews together. Such places were not only refuges, they were schools of piracy where a man could learn the craft of survival in a world without law. Legends too grew in these havens. Stories circulated of ghost ships, crewed by the damned of treasure, cursed, so that any man who touched it would meet a violent end, and of captains who dabbled in black magic to protect their fleets. Some whispered that Blackbeard himself, even before commanding his own ship, sought out such tales and cultivated them, knowing that fear was as valuable a weapon as any cannon. By the dawn of the 18th century, the pirate havens had become infamous across the world. European merchants cursed them navies, tried and failed to eradicate them, and sailors flocked to them in search of freedom, fortune, or simply survival. They were the crucibles in which legends were forged, and soon among them would rise a figure who would eclipse them all, the man with fire in his beard, whose name would strike terror from Virginia to the Spanish Main. In November of 1700, the death of King Charles II of Spain without an heir plunged Europe into turmoil. His will, named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Francis Louis XIV, as successor, but the Habsburgs of Austria contested the claim, and the other powers of Europe, particularly England and the Dutch Republic, feared that a Bourbon union of France and Spain would tilt the balance of power beyond recovery. The dispute erupted into a war that would last 13 years, known to history as the War of the Spanish Succession. This conflict spilled far beyond the battlefields of Europe. The Atlantic became a theatre of war, its waters roiling with naval clashes, privateering, and desperate campaigns to control the flow of wealth from the New World. England, under Queen Anne, poured resources into the fight, commissioning new warships and issuing letters of marque to countless private captains. To men of the sea, war meant employment, plunder, and the promise of legitimacy for deeds that would otherwise be branded criminal. It was likely in these years that Edward Teach found his first footing in the life that would make him infamous. While little is known of his early service, there are strong suggestions that he sailed the Caribbean during the conflict, perhaps aboard privateer vessels attacking Spanish shipping. Later accounts describe him as literate and well-mannered, a rarity among sailors of his age, and hint that he may have come from a reasonably comfortable family, one able to provide at least some education. This background, combined with his natural boldness, made him stand out in an environment where most men were illiterate and destitute. The war itself offered countless opportunities for daring men. English captains struck at Spanish treasure fleets, intercepting galleons heavy with silver and gold from Mexico and Peru. Battles raged from Newfoundland to the West Indies. Privateers operated with near impunity, and in places like Port Royal, their loot poured into the taverns and counting houses. To a young man like Teach, this world must have seemed both perilous and intoxicating. But as much as war opened doors, it also forged reputations. Legends began to circulate of a sailor whose audacity bordered on madness. Some tales claim that Teach once climbed the rigging during a cannon duel, shouting down at the enemy ship, as shot tore through the sails, daring them to aim higher. Others describe him as a man who never backed away from danger, who seemed to court it, as if testing whether fate itself would bend before him. The War of the Spanish Succession created thousands of men like Teach, skilled sailors, hardened by fire, who knew the riches that could be taken by force. Yet when peace finally came in 1713, with the Treaty of Utrecht, these same men were cast adrift. The letters of marque were revoked, the warships recalled, and the privateers left without employment. The empire had no use for them in peacetime. For many there was only one path left. Rather than return to poverty or humble labour, they turned to piracy. And among them was Edward Teach, who would take the lessons of war, the skills of privateering, and the fear he had already begun to inspire and forge them into a legend. The War of the Spanish Succession had been his crucible, and from its embers, Blackbeard would emerge. When the War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1713, thousands of sailors found themselves cut loose from legitimate employment. For a man like Edward Teach, trained in the crucible of war, the end of hostilities was less a relief than a crisis. The navy no longer needed him, and privateering commissions evaporated. Yet the sea still called, and ships heavy with treasure still crossed the Atlantic. In this vacuum piracy surged, and it was here that Teach began to distinguish himself. The details of his first forays into piracy are shadowy glimpsed only through fragments of record and rumour. He is thought to have sailed under the command of Benjamin Hornigold, one of the most influential pirates of the age. Hornigold operated out of Nassau in the Bahamas, which by then had become a de facto pirate republic. Their captains and crews ruled without interference from distant monarchs, and Nassau's harbour was filled with vessels flying the black flag. To a daring seaman, it was the perfect training ground. In Hornigold's service, Teach proved himself more than just another cutthroat. He showed skill in navigation, an iron will in combat, and above all, an uncanny ability to inspire fear. Contemporary accounts suggest that Teach could read and write, rare qualities that set him apart. He is said to have kept a journal, and while no copy has survived, some later tales describe him, sketching routes, recording spoils, and even writing down fragments of strange prayers or charms, as though he believed that words could bind fortune to his side. By 1716, Hornigold had given him command of his own sloop. It was an enormous vote of confidence, for to grant a man a vessel was to recognise him as a captain in his own right. With this promotion, Edward Teach began carving his own path. He joined raids against merchant ships off the American colonies, intercepting cargoes of sugar, cocoa, and tobacco. His attacks were swift and merciless, designed not just to take prizes but to terrify those who resisted. Legends began to cling to him, even at this early stage. One story tells of a night raid in which Teach's beard unkempt and his eyes wild lit slow-burning fuses under his hat, so that sparks and smoke wreathed his face in fire. The sight was so unnerving that a crew of English merchants surrendered without firing a shot, convinced they were facing not a man but a demon. Another tale claims he once fought off a Spanish ship with only half his crew, using deception and booming threats to make the enemy believe they were outnumbered. Whether these stories are true or exaggerated hardly matters. They were believed, and belief itself was a weapon. Teach understood instinctively that terror could break men as quickly as cannon fire. Every whispered tale of his daring or his devilry made the next encounter easier, for many ships struck their colours the moment they realised whose black flag approached. By the time his name was first recorded in colonial reports, Edward Teach was no longer an anonymous seaman. He was becoming a figure whispered about in taverns and feared along trade routes. His rise was swift, But it was only the beginning. The world had yet to see him in his full power, commanding not just a sloop, but a floating fortress, a ship that would become the stuff of nightmares, the Queen Anne's Revenge. In the shifting world of the Caribbean after the War of the Spanish Succession, strange partnerships often arose between men of radically different backgrounds. One of the most unusual was the alliance between Edward Teach and Stede Bonnet, the so-called gentleman pirate. Bonnet was unlike any other buccaneer of the age. Born into wealth in Barbados, he had inherited land, respect, and comfort. Yet dissatisfied with his privileged life, or perhaps driven by some hidden discontent, he abandoned it all to pursue the perilous career of piracy. Bonnet purchased a ship outright, an unusual step since most pirates seized their vessels by force. He christened it the Revenge and hired a crew. Though his lack of experience quickly became apparent, a gentleman by birth, Bonnet lacked the grit and seamanship of men who had weathered storms and battles since youth. His crew grew restless, and his early ventures were clumsy. It was during this uncertain period that he crossed paths with Edward Teach. Teach, by then rising rapidly in Hornigold's circle, recognised both Bonnet's weakness and his potential. Accounts suggest that he effectively took command of Bonnet's ship, offering guidance that the gentleman pirate could not provide. While Bonnet retained nominal authority, Teach steered the course of their joint operations, teaching the fledgling captain the brutal realities of life under the black flag. Together they launched a series of raids along the American coastline, seizing merchant vessels and striking terror into colonial ports. Teach's tactical brilliance complemented Bonnet's resources, while Bonnet's social standing provided Teach with an unusual partner, one whose presence only deepened the fascination surrounding their exploits. Here was a pirate who had been a gentleman farmer, sailing alongside a man already acquiring a reputation for devilry. The contrast made them infamous. Legends grew from their partnership. Sailors whispered that Bonnet, with his refined manner, would sometimes offer polite words as his crew looted cargo, while Teach stood beside him, wreathed in smoke and sparks embodying terror itself. One tale claims that Bonnet once attempted to negotiate peacefully with a captured crew only, for Teach to stride forward, his beard aflame, with slow matches and silence all protest with a single glare. The alliance also benefited Teach personally. With access to Bonnet's ship and men, his influence expanded. By late 1717, Hornigold's own career was waning. His refusal to attack English ships had cost him support among the more ruthless pirates. Teach, unburdened by such scruples, rose in his stead. The balance of power was shifting, and Edward Teach was stepping into the spotlight. Soon he would seize a prize greater than any yet taken, a ship that would transform him from a feared captain into a living legend. The seas that had tolerated his rise would soon quake under his name, for Edward Teach was on the brink of becoming Blackbeard in truth. By the late 1710, the Caribbean was alive with the fluttering of black flags. Pirates had become more than scattered outlaws. They were forming networks, loose but powerful alliances bound by common interest. This was the so-called Brotherhood of the Coast, an informal fraternity that stretched from Nassau to Tortuga, from the Outer Banks to the Spanish Main. And within this world, Edward Teach, soon to be known as Blackbeard, was carving his reputation. Nassau, on New Providence Island in the Bahamas, stood at the heart of this brotherhood. After the War of the Spanish Succession, disbanded privateers poured into the harbour, transforming it into a haven for outlaws. Its shallow waters and tangled reefs offered protection from warships, while its taverns and makeshift courts provided a kind of anarchic order. Here, captains struck bargains, traded stolen cargo, and shared intelligence about rich targets. Nassau was no mere port, it was a pirate republic, and for men like Teach, it was both sanctuary and school. Within this world, Teach's alliance with Stede Bonnet helped him rise quickly. Bonnet's Revenge became one of several ships under Teach's influence, and together they joined forces with other notable captains. Reports speak of fleets numbering 5 or 6 vessels, coordinating raids along the American coast and in the Caribbean. Each victory added to their reputation, and soon, Teach's name alone was enough to send panic through colonial shipping lanes. The Pirate Brotherhood had its own strange order. Crews drafted articles that dictated how loot was divided, how injuries were compensated, and how disputes were resolved. While brutal, these codes provided a sense of fairness absent in the rigid hierarchies of naval life. To many sailors, piracy offered something that the Navy and Merchant Service never did, a voice, however small, in their own fate. Teach thrived in this atmosphere. His authority did not come from wealth or birth like Bonnet's, but from charisma, audacity, and fear. He was the kind of leader men followed because they believed he would lead them to victory, or at least to terrorize their enemies so completely that resistance became futile. Tales circulated of him, brooding silently at the prow, sparks smouldering in his beard, while crews whispered that their captain was half man, half devil. It was also during this period that Teach began experimenting with psychological warfare. Survivors of his raids reported that he cultivated his fearsome image, deliberately staging his entrances with smoke, fire, and booming threats. The sight of him alone often caused merchant crews to surrender without a fight. Fear, he realized, was worth more than any cannon. As his reputation grew, so too did the whispers. Some claimed he had struck bargains with otherworldly powers, that his invincibility in battle came not from skill, but from sorcery. Others swore that he carried a book of charms spells, written in a hand no man could read, which he consulted before raids. Whether these were lies, exaggerations, or fragments of truth, they spread like wildfire, and Teach himself did little to discourage them. The more terrifying the legend, the less blood he needed to spill. By 1717, the Brotherhood of the Coast had reached its zenith, and among its captains, Edward Teach was emerging as a figure of singular dread. He had not yet achieved the height of his infamy, but the foundation had been laid. The seas trembled at the approach of his ships, and the colonies braced themselves for the storm that was coming. The age of Blackbeard was about to begin in earnest. By the end of 1717, Edward Teach had risen from a mere lieutenant under Benjamin Hornigold to an independent captain of growing renown. His partnership with Stede Bonnet had given him access to ships, men, and experience. But by now, Teach was no longer content to serve as anyone's second. Ambition burned within him, and the world would soon learn that his appetite for power and terror knew no limits. The ship that symbolized this ambition was Bonnet's Revenge. Though Bonnet remained its nominal owner, his lack of skill meant that Teach increasingly dictated its operations. Colonial reports began to speak of Teach as its true master, with Bonnet little more than a figurehead. It was during this period that Teach's authority became undeniable. His name appeared in the correspondence of colonial governors, noted as a captain to be watched, feared, and hunted. But Teach sought more than borrowed command. He began capturing prizes of his own swelling, his small fleet with captured sloops. Each new vessel added not only firepower, but legitimacy among his peers. To hold command of a ship taken by force was the purest mark of pirate authority. With every successful raid, Teach stepped further out of Hornigold's shadow, until he was recognized as a captain in his own right. His ambition extended beyond ships to reputation. Teach understood better than most that a pirate's greatest weapon was fear. He cultivated his image with deliberate care, his towering frame, his wild beard, and his terrifying rituals of battle. The stories of him weaving slow-burning fuses into his hair, letting smoke curl around his face as he strode the decks, may have begun here. Sailors who surrendered without a fight often spread these tales, embellishing them in terror, but Teach encouraged it. Every exaggeration worked in his favour. There were darker whispers too. Some claimed that Teach practiced occult rites, that he muttered prayers in forgotten tongues before battle, or that he spilled rum into the sea as an offering to restless spirits. Others believed that his beard itself held power, that the smoke and sparks he kindled were signs he was more demon than man. Whether true or not, these rumours spread quickly, and Teach, ever the master of theatre, never denied them. By late 1717, the name Edward Teach had become synonymous with dread. Merchant captains spoke it with unease, colonial governors cursed it in frustration, and sailors whispered it in taverns like an incantation. The man who had once been a nameless seaman was now a force to be reckoned with, yet his rise was far from over. He had not yet seized the ship that would make him a legend, nor unleashed the reign of terror that would etch his name into history. The seas were filled with riches, and Teach hungered for more. Soon he would capture a prize so great that it would transform him from a feared captain into a living myth. The vessel that would bear his ambition forward was waiting for him on the horizon, and with it Edward Teach would become Blackbeard in full. In late 1717, Edward Teach's destiny arrived in the form of a French slave ship. The vessel, La Concorde de Nantes, had already endured a grim voyage across the Atlantic, transporting enslaved Africans from West Africa to the Caribbean. Like many such ships, it was large, heavily built, and capable of carrying vast amounts of cargo, precisely the kind of prize a pirate captain dreamed of commanding. Teach, already in control of several smaller sloops, sighted the ship off the island of Martinique. With his growing fleet at his back, he gave chase. The encounter was swift. The French crew, weakened by disease after their brutal voyage, offered little resistance. Teach's men swarmed aboard, and in a matter of hours, La Concorde belonged to him. It was more than just a victory, it was the turning point of his career. The ship was refitted, her holds emptied of human misery, and prepared instead for war. Teach mounted 40 guns on her decks, transforming her into one of the most formidable pirate vessels ever to sail the Caribbean. He renamed her the Queen Anne's Revenge, a name that resonated with both defiance and nostalgia. Some scholars believe it referenced England's recently deceased Queen Anne, under whose reign many pirates had first earned their fortunes as privateers. Others suggest it was a jab at King George I, implying loyalty to the Stuart cause. Whatever the truth, the name itself was a statement. This ship was a weapon of vengeance. With the Queen Anne's Revenge as his flagship, Teach's power expanded overnight. He was no longer merely a daring captain of a swift sloop. He was the master of a floating fortress. Merchant vessels that might once have considered fighting stood no chance against his 40 guns. Even colonial warships hesitated, for few could match her firepower. To encounter the Queen Anne's Revenge on the open sea was to face near certain doom. Teach's legend grew in proportion to his new command. The ship itself became part of his mythos, described in fearful tones by survivors and colonial governors alike. They wrote of her black hull, cutting through the water, of the roar of her cannons, and of Blackbeard himself, striding the decks, his beard alight with smouldering fuses. Sailors who glimpsed the Queen Anne's Revenge on the horizon often surrendered without resistance, preferring captivity to annihilation. But the ship carried more than guns, it carried symbolism. The Queen Anne's Revenge embodied Teach's transformation from Edward. Teach, ambitious pirate, into Blackbeard, the scourge of the Atlantic. With her he could blockade ports, command fleets, and challenge empires. She was his weapon, his stage, and his throne. Legends soon attached themselves to the vessel. Some said her timbers groaned with the voices of the enslaved who had died within her hull, their spirits now bound to Blackbeard's service. Others claimed the ship could never be sunk, that Blackbeard had performed dark rituals to bind her to his soul. Whether whispered in terror or awe, these tales only magnified her reputation. From the moment he seized La Concorde, Edward Teach ceased to be merely another pirate among dozens. With the Queen Anne's Revenge under his command, he had ascended into legend. The seas of the Caribbean and the coasts of North America would never be the same again. With the Queen Anne's Revenge under his command, Edward Teach's ascent was meteoric. No longer a mere pirate among dozens, He was now the master of one of the most formidable ships in the Western Atlantic. Word of his victories spread swiftly, carried on the lips of sailors, merchants, and governors. In a matter of months, Blackbeard had become more than a man. He was a looming presence, a storm upon the horizon. The firepower of his flagship allowed him to build a fleet. Smaller sloops captured during raids were pressed into service. Their crews offered a choice: join or die. Many chose to join. In this way, Blackbeard's forces grew until, at times, he commanded 4 or 5 ships at once, manned by hundreds of hardened pirates. Together they cut a swath across the Caribbean and the American coastline. Colonial governors sent panicked reports to London, describing Blackbeard's raids with a mixture of horror and disbelief. He was said to blockade harbours, stopping all ships until ransoms were paid. He seized cargoes of rum, sugar, cocoa, and indigo, selling them back through networks of corrupt merchants and officials. In some places, his arrival meant famine, for supplies could not pass his blockade. For those who resisted, he offered no mercy. For those who yielded quickly, he often let them live, a calculated gesture to ensure that word of his power spread even further. Fear was his most potent weapon. Survivors described his terrifying visage in ever more elaborate detail. His thick black beard was said to cover his entire face, braided into coils tied with ribbons. He lit slow-burning fuses beneath his hat so that smoke and sparks surrounded his head in battle, transforming him into a demonic figure striding through fire. Some swore his eyes glowed red in the smoke, while others insisted he spoke in a voice that seemed not entirely human. Whether these were exaggerations or deliberate performances, they worked. Crews surrendered at the mere sight of him, preferring to give up their cargo rather than face what seemed like the devil himself. Yet behind the terror, there was calculation. Blackbeard rarely killed needlessly. His goal was dominance, not slaughter. By fostering his reputation for cruelty, he reduced the need for violence. A merchant crew that struck its colours spared him the cost of a battle and added to his reputation at the same time. In this way, he mastered both the art of war and the art of theatre, blending them into a single, terrifying strategy. Legends of his raids began to spread inland. Farmers along the Carolina coast whispered his name. Merchants in London spoke of him with dread. Spanish officials in Havana cursed him as a plague, and in Nassau, his reputation elevated him to the ranks of pirate royalty. He was no longer just a captain. He was a king of the outlaw seas, feared by empires and worshipped by desperate men who craved the freedom he embodied. Still, even as his power grew, Blackbeard knew it was precarious. Pirate empires rose and fell with terrifying speed. One decisive naval engagement could end it all, and yet perhaps that was the allure. His reign was destined to burn brightly and briefly, leaving behind a legend that no governor's gallows could erase. With the Queen Anne's revenge at his back and fear itself as his ally, Blackbeard stood at the height of his power. The world trembled at his name, and yet the greatest chapters of his story were still to come. Among all the tools at Blackbeard's disposal, his ships, his guns, his men, none was more effective than his own terrifying image. Unlike most captains who relied solely on firepower and brute strength, Blackbeard understood the value of theatre. He became the first true master of psychological warfare at sea, crafting a persona so dreadful that entire crews would surrender at the mere sight of him. Contemporary accounts describe him as a tall, broad-shouldered man with piercing eyes and a thick, jet-black beard that reached his chest. He grew it long and wild, often braiding it into coils tied with ribbons, making his visage all the more striking. Yet the beard was only the foundation. Before battle, he wove lengths of slow-burning fuses into his hair and beard, lighting them so that smoke and sparks curled about his face. To those who faced him across the deck, it appeared as though he strode through hellfire itself, a demon in human form. Sailors claimed his eyes gleamed red through the smoke, that his voice boomed like thunder as he shouted orders, and that his very presence could sap a man's will to fight. Such details may have been exaggerations, but they carried power. In an age when superstition ran deep, to see a towering figure wreathed in fire and smoke was enough to convince many that they were not fighting a man at all, but something supernatural. Even his name, Blackbeard, became a weapon. It was simple, memorable, and perfectly suited to the image he projected. Reports of his exploits spread across the Atlantic, and each telling grew darker. Some said he was impervious to bullets, others that he had made a pact with the devil himself. A few swore that he could not be killed on land, only at sea. Whether true or false, such myths magnified his aura of invincibility. Blackbeard encouraged these stories. Survivors of his raids were often spared, sent home to spread tales of his terror. In this way, he let fear do his work for him. Ships that recognized his flag frequently surrendered without a shot, knowing that resistance meant facing the devil of the seas. By carefully cultivating this reputation, Blackbeard reduced the need for bloodshed while increasing the scale of his success. Yet his fearsome image was not limited to appearance alone. He was said to drink rum mixed with gunpowder, a concoction that horrified and fascinated his crew. He staged elaborate displays of fury, firing pistols into the air during feasts or brandishing swords in mock duels that sometimes left men injured. These acts blurred the line between madness and performance, keeping his followers both loyal and afraid. Legends spiraled out of control. Some claimed he could summon storms to wreck his enemies, others that he carried a book of forbidden spells. One tale insisted that his beard itself was enchanted, that as long as it remained unshorn, no blade could harm him. Absurd as these stories may sound, they played into the atmosphere of dread that surrounded him. To his enemies, Blackbeard was no mere pirate, he was a force of nature. It was this cultivated image, more than any cannon or cutlass, that secured his place in history. Pirates came and went, but few understood that fear could conquer as effectively as violence. Blackbeard's mastery of appearance was his greatest weapon, and it would make him immortal in legend long after his body was gone. For all his mastery of fear and discipline in battle, Blackbeard was also remembered for the excesses that marked pirate life. To his enemies he was a devil, but to his crew he was both leader and companion, a man who revelled in the chaos that bound them together. His reputation for drinking revelry and theatrics was as much a part of his legend as his fearsome appearance. Pirates lived hard and drank harder. Rum flowed endlessly through their camps and ships, often mixed with water, sugar, lime, or whatever else was available. Blackbeard, however, is said to have taken his indulgence to extremes. Tales circulated that he drank rum infused with gunpowder, swallowing fire and smoke, as though it were a potion of invincibility. Some claimed that after such drinks he would roar with laughter and fire pistols into the air, terrifying friend and foe alike. Whether entirely true or not, these stories reinforced his persona as a man beyond human restraint. Feasts aboard his ships were legendary. Captured stores of wine, brandy and food were devoured in nights of debauchery. The deck would be lit by lanterns and torches, music and shouting echoing across the waves. Blackbeard was at the centre of it all, sometimes generous, sometimes violent, always unpredictable. He would duel his own men in drunken contests, slashing with blades until blood was drawn, then laugh as though it were nothing more than sport. His crew tolerated it, even admired it, for it kept alive the sense that their captain was both fearless and untouchable. But alongside this revelry grew darker tales. Sailors whispered that Blackbeard kept a diary of strange rituals, filled not only with accounts of plunder, but also incantations and charms. Some believed he sought protection from supernatural forces, binding his fate to the sea itself. Others thought the book a fabrication, a story spread by survivors who wanted to explain the uncanny aura he carried. Regardless, the image of Blackbeard as a man dabbling in forbidden knowledge only fueled his legend. His relationships were no less colourful. Reports suggest that he took multiple wives, though whether these were formal marriages or temporary unions is unclear. In one notorious story, he supposedly declared to a crew that he would take a young woman as his bride, and during the drunken ceremony, he forced her into humiliating displays before the men. Such accounts may have been embellished by enemies, eager to paint him as monstrous, but they reinforce the sense of a man who lived by no law, neither divine nor human. Despite these tales of cruelty, many of his crew remained fiercely loyal. They followed him not only out of fear, but out of belief that under Blackbeard fortune would favour them. He shared loot, according to the pirate code, rewarded bravery, and allowed his men a voice in decisions. Life under Blackbeard was harsh, but it promised equality and freedom that few sailors ever experienced under the rigid discipline of the navy or merchant service. Thus the legend grew in two directions at once. To his enemies he was the devil incarnate, a monster whose beard smoked with fire and whose heart was blacker than the night sea. To his followers he was both terror and protector, a man who led them into danger, but also into riches. In this paradox lay the essence of his power. Blackbeard was whatever men most feared or most desired him to be. And while the rum-soaked nights and violent displays captured imaginations, they were only one side of his story. For behind the chaos, Blackbeard remained calculating, always preparing for the next strike, the next blockade, the next step in building his legend. His reign of terror was just reaching its peak, and soon he would make his boldest move yet. By 1717 and 1718, Blackbeard was no longer a rising name, he was a dominant force. His flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, and his fleet of accompanying sloops gave him power unmatched by most colonial navies in the Western Atlantic. This period, remembered by sailors and chroniclers alike, became known as Blackbeard's Winter, a season in which his shadow stretched across the Caribbean and the American seaboard. During these months he prowled the waters of the West Indies and the southern colonies of North America, striking fear wherever his sails appeared. Merchant ships laden with sugar, rum, cocoa, and indigo were his primary targets. Yet it was not only the value of the cargo that mattered, it was the performance of dominance. He blockaded harbours, captured ships in broad daylight, and sent survivors ashore with chilling tales. Fear itself became part of his arsenal. Blackbeard's tactics revealed both cunning and cruelty. Rather than scatter his strength, he concentrated his forces, overwhelming merchant convoys and leaving governors powerless. Colonial militias lacked the naval power to oppose him, and European warships were spread thin across the Atlantic. For months, Blackbeard moved with near impunity, his name inspiring panic in every port. Some reports claim that when his sails appeared off the coast, entire towns shut down their trade until he moved on. This winter also cemented his reputation as a figure larger than life. Stories circulated of him feasting in captured towns, demanding barrels of rum and livestock as ransom before allowing merchants to continue their trade. He often spared lives deliberately so that stories of his mercy would be told alongside stories of his terror. Such duality enhanced his legend. Blackbeard could be cruel, but he could also be unpredictable, a devil who sometimes showed mercy and sometimes did not. No one could ever be sure, and uncertainty was its own form of power. Yet amid the raids there were moments of strange theatrics. Survivors recalled that during feasts aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge, he would fire pistols beneath the table or extinguish candles with sword strokes, startling even his own crew. Some said he would vanish into his cabin with a handful of followers and emerge hours later, faces pale as though they had participated in some grim ritual. Whether these were drunken games or calculated performances, they fueled the aura of sorcery that clung to him. Whispers spread that Blackbeard was more than a man. Some claimed he could not be killed by musket fire, that blades turned aside from his skin. Others said he had bargained with the devil at a crossroads, offering his soul in exchange for invincibility at sea. A few even believed that his beard itself was enchanted, that each spark that burned within it was the soul of a man he had slain. These tales wild, though they were spread quickly, and Blackbeard never discouraged them. By the spring of 1718, Blackbeard's reign of fear had reached a crescendo. Governors begged London for aid, merchants cursed his name, and his fellow pirates looked upon him with awe. He was not merely raiding for plunder, he was reshaping the very balance of power in the Atlantic. For the first time, a single pirate captain was seen as a threat, not just to individual ships, but to entire colonies. Yet Blackbeard was not finished. The boldest act of his career was still ahead of him, a move so audacious that it would shock the colonies and cement his place as the most notorious pirate of the age. The target would not be a single ship, nor even a fleet, but an entire city. In the spring of 1718, Blackbeard made his boldest move, yet one that would shock the American colonies and cement his reputation as the most audacious pirate of his age. His target was not a lone ship, nor a scattering of merchantmen, but an entire city, Charleston, South Carolina. At the time, Charleston was one of the busiest ports in the American colonies, a vital hub of trade and wealth. Its harbour teemed with vessels bearing rice, indigo, lumber, and enslaved Africans, all destined for markets across the Atlantic. By seizing control of this port, even for a short time, a pirate could strangle commerce and hold an entire colony hostage. Blackbeard, with the Queen Anne's Revenge and a fleet of accompanying ships, was in the perfect position to attempt just that. In May of 1718, he appeared off the bar at Charleston with 4 vessels and hundreds of men. He anchored at the harbour's entrance, effectively sealing the port. No ship could pass in or out without facing the black flags of his fleet. For nearly a week, Blackbeard ruled the waters, capturing incoming and outgoing vessels alike. Panic gripped the city as news spread that the infamous pirate had blockaded their lifeline to the sea. But Blackbeard's demand was not gold or silver. He wanted medicine. Accounts suggest that disease had spread through his fleet, leaving many of his men in need of treatment. He sent envoys ashore, including prisoners taken from captured ships, with instructions to secure a chest of medical supplies. To prove he was serious, he made it clear that the lives of the hostages, including some of Charleston's most prominent citizens, hung in the balance. The negotiations dragged on, but Blackbeard held his ground. He maintained the blockade, seizing ships while waiting for the supplies. For the citizens of Charleston, it was a humiliating and terrifying ordeal. Their port, the pride of the colony, had been brought to its knees, not by an invading navy, but by a pirate king. Eventually, the medicines were delivered, and true to his word, Blackbeard released the hostages, unharmed. It was an outcome that baffled his enemies. He had humiliated a colony, stolen its goods, and yet refrained from the wholesale slaughter that might have been expected. The blockade of Charleston was more than just a raid, it was a statement. Blackbeard had demonstrated that no colony, no city, and no governor was beyond his reach. He could hold a major port hostage at will, and there was little the authorities could do to stop him. The event sent shockwaves across the Atlantic world, and reports of his audacity reached London, where officials began to demand decisive action. Legends naturally embroidered the tale. Some said that during the blockade, Blackbeard threw wild feasts aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge, mocking the citizens of Charleston while their ships rotted in the harbour. Others swore that he threatened to burn the city to the ground if his demands were not met, and that only the chest of medicine stayed his hand. Whatever the embellishments, the truth was enough. Blackbeard had brought one of the richest colonies in North America to its knees. For Blackbeard, the Charleston blockade marked the height of his power. He had humbled a colony and enriched his coffers and deepened the legend of his invincibility. Yet the boldness of the act also ensured that his days of relative freedom were numbered. No empire could tolerate such defiance forever. From this point on, the noose was tightening. The crown would soon move to crush him, and Blackbeard's reign of terror would begin its final chapter. The audacity of the Charleston blockade sent ripples far beyond South Carolina. Across the colonies, governors fumed, merchants raged, and London itself took notice. Blackbeard had humiliated an English colony in full view of the Atlantic world, and the crown could not allow such defiance to stand. What had once been a nuisance tolerated in the shadows of empire was now declared an existential threat to commerce and royal authority. King George I had already issued the proclamation for suppressing pirates in 1717, offering pardons to those who surrendered and death to those who refused. At first, the gesture was unevenly enforced. Many colonial governors were reluctant to act too harshly, preferring to profit quietly from pirate trade rather than risk open confrontation. But after Charleston, the mood changed. Blackbeard had shown that pirates could not simply be ignored. They had to be crushed. In the summer of 1718, British warships were dispatched with renewed vigour to hunt the outlaw fleets. The Bahamas, once a pirate haven, were retaken under the governorship of Woodes Rogers himself, a former privateer who knew the pirate trade intimately. Rogers arrived in Nassau with royal backing soldiers and ships determined to stamp out the pirate republic. His motto emblazoned for all to see was blunt: Expulsis piratis, restituta commercia, pirates expelled, commerce restored. The crackdown was swift. Dozens of pirates accepted the king's pardon, eager to exchange the gallows for safety. Others fled deeper into the Caribbean or turned northward, seeking refuge in the shadows of the Carolina coast. Yet for men like Blackbeard, the choice was not so simple. He had grown too powerful, too notorious. To surrender would mean forfeiting his empire of fear. To resist meant risking annihilation at the hands of the crown. Blackbeard chose a middle path. Reports suggest that he flirted with the idea of accepting the king's pardon, if only as a temporary measure. He sailed north toward North Carolina, where the governor Charles Eden was rumoured to be more accommodating than his counterparts. In exchange for bribes and a share of plunder, Eden turned a blind eye to pirate activities, issuing papers that gave a thin veneer of legitimacy. For a time it seemed Blackbeard had found a way to balance on the knife's edge between outlaw and subject. But the royal crackdown was relentless. Governors who refused to act were pressured by London. Naval commanders were ordered to make examples of pirate captains, their bodies displayed as warnings. The days of pirate dominance were closing, and even Blackbeard, with all his fire and fury, could feel the noose tightening. Legends claim that during this time, Blackbeard became increasingly restless. Some said he spoke of omens of dreams filled with fire and blood, as though he sensed his end drawing near. Others whispered that he performed secret rituals, burying treasure in hidden coves, convinced that death was stalking him. Whether fact or fiction, the stories reflected a truth. The age of unchecked piracy was ending, and even Blackbeard could not escape the tightening grip of empire. Still, he was not finished. His retreat to North Carolina was not a surrender but a repositioning. He would bide his time, rebuild his strength, and strike again. The crackdown may have scattered his brothers of the coast, but Edward Teach had no intention of fading quietly into obscurity. His tale was racing toward its bloody climax. If the Crown's crackdown threatened Blackbeard's reign, the fractured politics of the colonies offered him opportunities for survival. Nowhere was this clearer than in the uneasy relationship between Governor Charles Eden of North Carolina and Governor Alexander Spotswood of Virginia. Between these two men, Blackbeard found both protection and a deadly enemy. Governor Eden ruled North Carolina with a lax hand. His colony was poor, its coastline long and difficult to patrol, its harbours shallow and isolated. Unlike Charleston or Nassau, it had no bustling centres of trade to protect, and thus fewer reasons to wage costly campaigns against pirates. For Eden, turning a blind eye, or even accepting bribes, was a practical solution. Reports suggest that Blackbeard exploited this weakness to the fullest, offering gifts of gold, rum, and sugar in exchange for legal protection. Some claimed that Eden issued him certificates of clearance for captured ships, laundering pirate plunder into legitimate commerce. In stark contrast, Governor Spotswood of Virginia was determined to stamp out piracy. Wealthier and better connected than his southern neighbour, Spotswood saw pirates not only as a threat to trade, but as an affront to royal authority. He lobbied London for support, demanded naval intervention, and swore that men like Blackbeard would face the noose. To him, Eden's tolerance was not just negligence, but treachery. This clash of approaches created fertile ground for intrigue. Rumours spread that Eden and his officials were complicit in Blackbeard's activities, taking their cut of the loot while issuing papers that kept him safe. One particularly damning tale claimed that Blackbeard hosted feasts for local magistrates, toasting their health with stolen wine, while his men caroused with the governor's blessing. Whether entirely true or exaggerated by enemies, the image stuck North Carolina was seen as a nest of corruption where pirates thrived under official protection. For Blackbeard, this arrangement was perfect. It allowed him to linger in the quiet inlets of the Outer Banks, repairing ships, resupplying, and enjoying the spoils of his raids. His men could blend into the scattered settlements, spending their shares and stirring up both admiration and resentment among the locals. The people of the coast, often neglected by distant colonial authorities, sometimes welcomed the pirates who brought coin and goods otherwise scarce in the region. Yet the arrangement could not last. Spotswood's anger grew as Blackbeard's presence in North Carolina became impossible to ignore. He accused Eden of complicity and began plotting to act without waiting for London's permission. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would pit colony against colony, governor against governor, and ultimately empire against outlaw. Meanwhile, the legends deepened. Sailors whispered that Blackbeard had become untouchable, that even governors bowed to his will. Others claimed that he carried out secret rituals in the swamps of Carolina, burying treasure by moonlight and chanting prayers in strange tongues to keep it hidden. Some said that the marshes themselves protected him, rising with fog whenever strangers approached. In reality, his survival owed less to sorcery than to politics. The corruption and divisions of the colonies bought him time, but it was time quickly running out. Virginia's governor was sharpening his sword, and soon Blackbeard would face the deadliest gamble of his career. In June of 1718, fate struck a blow against Blackbeard that no enemy cannon could deliver. After months of terrorizing the seas, his flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, met her end in the shifting sands off North Carolina's coast. The circumstances remained debated, but the wreck of his mighty fortress marked a turning point in his story. The Queen Anne's Revenge had become both his throne and his terror. With 40 guns and a fearsome reputation, she made Blackbeard nearly invincible. Yet the waters of the Outer Banks, notorious for their treacherous shoals and hidden sandbars, cared nothing for legend. As Blackbeard manoeuvred near Beaufort Inlet, the ship ran aground. Some accounts claim that poor navigation or overconfidence doomed her, while others whisper that the wreck was no accident at all. One theory holds that Blackbeard deliberately grounded his flagship, using the disaster as a way to break up his large crew. By stranding men ashore and reducing his following, he could keep a tighter circle of loyalists and hoard more plunder for himself. If true, it revealed the calculating side of his nature, willing to sacrifice ships and men alike for personal advantage. Contemporary reports describe the scene vividly. The great vessel stuck fast, her timbers groaning as waves pounded her hull. Smaller sloops scrambled to assist, but the Queen Anne's Revenge was lost. Alongside her, another ship in Blackbeard's fleet also foundered. What might have been a catastrophic blow to a lesser captain became in Blackbeard's hands another twist in his legend. He salvaged what he could, gathered his most trusted men, and slipped away into the labyrinthine inlets of North Carolina. The wreck shocked colonial governors. Here was proof that even the most terrifying pirate was vulnerable not to naval power, but to the sea itself. Yet the loss of his flagship did not diminish his aura. If anything, it added a new layer of mystery. Some claimed he had sunk her deliberately to hide treasure in her holds. Others believed the wreck was cursed, haunted by the spirits of the enslaved who had once filled her decks. Sailors swore that at night ghostly lights flickered over the site, and that the sound of chains rattling could be heard beneath the waves. Centuries later, divers would indeed locate the wreck near Beaufort, uncovering cannons, anchors, and remnants of her structure. The discovery confirmed the truth of her fate, but for Blackbeard's contemporaries, the wreck became fuel for rumour and fear. Even without his floating fortress, the man himself remained a danger, prowling the coast with smaller vessels and a loyal band of followers. The loss of the Queen Anne's Revenge marks the end of Blackbeard's golden peak, but not of his legend. Stripped of his grand ship, he adapted, becoming more elusive, more unpredictable. His enemies may have believed that the wreck signalled his decline, but Edward Teach was far from finished. He was preparing for his final act, one that would etch his name in history forever. In the wake of the Queen Anne's Revenge wreck, Blackbeard's fortunes appeared to falter. Yet, the cunning captain was never without a plan. As the Crown tightened its grip on piracy, issuing pardons for those who surrendered, Edward Teach saw an opportunity to step briefly out of the storm and cloak himself, however thinly, in legality. King George I's 1717 proclamation had offered amnesty to any pirate who surrendered by a fixed deadline. Many captains ignored it at first, but after Nassau fell to Governor Woodes Rogers in 1718, the offer carried new weight. For some, the pardon meant survival. For Blackbeard, it was something more, a temporary shield behind which he could manoeuvre. In June 1718, he sailed to Bath, North Carolina, and presented himself to Governor Charles Eden. Eden, whose lax governance had already drawn suspicion, welcomed the notorious pirate. With a stroke of the pen, Blackbeard received a royal pardon. For a brief moment, Edward Teach was no longer an outlaw, but a subject of the Crown. His enemies raged, calling it corruption, but on paper at least, Blackbeard was cleansed of his crimes. Yet it was an illusion. Almost immediately he returned to his old ways, slipping back into piracy under the guise of legitimacy. He exploited his pardon to anchor openly in North Carolina's inlets, claiming the protection of the governor even as he raided passing ships. Some reports suggest that Eden himself profited from these activities, accepting bribes or shares of plunder in exchange for turning a blind eye. To colonial authorities in Virginia and beyond it was nothing short of betrayal. For Blackbeard, however, the pardon was a masterstroke. It allowed him to resupply and repair his ships and rest his men without fear of sudden reprisal. Locals in the scattered coastal settlements welcomed the influx of goods and coin, even if they came by way of piracy. Farmers and merchants who had little love for distant governors found in Blackbeard a strange kind of benefactor, one who could provide what legitimate trade did not. Still, whispers persisted. Survivors of captured ships swore that Blackbeard's supposed retirement was a sham, that he still stalked the seas whenever opportunity arose. One tale claimed he staged his raids carefully, seizing vessels just beyond the line of Eden's jurisdiction, then returning to his safe harbour under the guise of innocence. Another rumour suggested he buried treasure in the Carolina marshes, performing strange rites by firelight to ensure that only he could reclaim it. The pardon bought him time, but it also deepened the rift between North Carolina and Virginia. Governor Spotswood of Virginia, already furious at Eden's tolerance, now viewed Blackbeard not as a pirate in decline, but as a serpent shielded by corruption. He began to plot, determined to end the menace by force if necessary, even if it meant defying jurisdiction and striking across colonial borders. For Blackbeard, the king's pardon was never meant as a surrender. It was a mask, a tool to prolong his reign. But beneath that mask, the fire still burned. He was not ready to fade into quiet obscurity. His legend demanded a climax, and the Crown, through Spotswood's fury, was preparing to give him one. The ink of Blackbeard's pardon was barely dry before he proved once again that he had no intention of abandoning piracy. Though he had sworn fealty to the Crown, his actions told another story. The pardon had been a clever pause, a way to disarm his enemies and rebuild strength. Now he returned to the life that defined him, raiding, plundering, and weaving himself ever deeper into legend. Operating from the shallow sounds and hidden inlets of North Carolina, he struck with the same ferocity that had made him infamous. Ships sailing between the colonies and the Caribbean continued to vanish, reappearing stripped of their cargo or reported as prizes in Blackbeard's fleet. Some accounts describe him luring vessels with false signals, lighting lanterns to mimic safe harbor, only to descend upon them in the night. The pirate who had once blockaded Charleston was not done terrorizing the seas. What made this period especially dangerous was the illusion of legitimacy. With Eden's pardon in his pocket, Blackbeard moved freely among settlements, presenting himself as a reformed man while continuing his raids offshore. Locals, torn between fear and admiration, tolerated his presence. He spent freely, brought goods into communities, often neglected by official trade, and cultivated loyalty through generosity as much as intimidation. Yet his unpredictability deepened his legend. Some stories claim that during this time he staged elaborate feasts in the marshlands, where he and his crew roasted cattle stolen from nearby farms and drank rum until dawn. At the height of such gatherings, he would suddenly fire pistols into the air, or duel his own men for amusement, leaving them bloodied but laughing. To outsiders, these tales painted him as a madman, a devil wearing the mask of a man. To his followers, he was something more, a captain who embodied both terror and freedom. There were whispers, too, of hidden treasure. Survivors swore he spoke of burying chests in secret places, performing rituals to guard them from discovery. Some even believed he had written down clues in a coded journal, a book said to contain not only maps but spells. None of these treasures have ever been found, but the legends themselves became part of his myth, ensuring that centuries later, fortune seekers would still hunt for Blackbeard's gold. His return to piracy infuriated colonial leaders. To Spotswood of Virginia, it was the final proof that Blackbeard could not be controlled. He had humiliated colonies, mocked the king's pardon, and made a mockery of law. To Eden, the situation grew delicate. His leniency was now drawing accusations of complicity, and whispers of corruption threatened his position. Still, Eden hesitated, perhaps unwilling or unable to challenge the man whose shadow loomed over his colony. For Blackbeard, the game was nearing its end, though he may not have realised how quickly the noose was tightening. His raids, his theatrics, his very existence had pushed the colonies to a breaking point. Soon Governor Spotswood would act, and Blackbeard would face the battle that would define his legend forever. By the autumn of 1718, Governor Alexander Spotswood of Virginia had run out of patience. Blackbeard's return to piracy after his pardon was not just an embarrassment, it was an open insult to royal authority. Charleston had been humiliated, commerce strangled, and North Carolina's governor suspected of corruption. Spotswood resolved to end the menace once and for all, even if it meant crossing borders and acting without permission. He assembled a strike force in secret. 2 sloops, the Ranger and the Jane, were fitted out for battle and placed under the command of Lieutenant Robert Maynard, a determined officer of the Royal Navy. Maynard was given explicit orders: hunt down Blackbeard and bring him back dead or alive. To keep the mission quiet, Spotswood avoided notifying Governor Eden of North Carolina, knowing that word might slip back to Blackbeard before the trap could be sprung. Meanwhile, Blackbeard lingered at Ocracoke Inlet, one of the many sheltered passages along the Outer Banks. There he anchored with a handful of loyal men and a small sloop, unaware of the storm gathering against him. Accounts suggest that he spent his final days, much as he had lived, drinking heavily, hosting feasts aboard his vessel, and entertaining guests from the mainland. Some say he even spoke of retiring, though whether he meant it is anyone's guess. On the morning of the 22nd of November 1718, Maynard's sloop slipped into the inlet. Blackbeard spotted them and realised too late that he was cornered. With only a fraction of his old fleet, he faced overwhelming odds. Still, retreat was not in his nature. He prepared for battle, loading his cannons and rallying his men with shouts that echoed across the water. The fight was savage. Blackbeard unleashed a devastating broadside, ripping through Maynard's ships and killing many of his men. But Maynard, anticipating the ferocity of the attack, had kept most of his crew hidden below decks. When Blackbeard's pirates boarded expecting easy victory, Maynard's men swarmed out and a desperate hand-to-hand struggle erupted. Pistols cracked, cutlasses clashed, and the decks ran slick with blood. In the chaos, Blackbeard fought like a man possessed. Witnesses later swore that he battled with superhuman strength, taking shot after shot wounds that would have felled any other man. Maynard himself engaged him in combat, and the two clashed amid the smoke and shouting. Finally, after being struck by multiple musket balls and slashed across the neck, Blackbeard staggered. It is said he still fought on, refusing to yield, until one last blow brought him down. When the smoke cleared, the legend of Blackbeard lay dead on the deck. He had been struck by 5 bullets and more than 20 sword cuts before collapsing. Even in death, he had proven the myth true, that it would take extraordinary force to end him. His head was severed and hung from Maynard's bowsprit as proof of victory. His body was thrown into the waters of Ocracoke, where sailors claimed it swam 3 times around the ship before sinking, as if even in death he defied nature. The showdown at Ocracoke ended Blackbeard's reign, but it did not diminish his legend. If anything, his ferocious final stand elevated him, cementing his place as the most feared pirate of the Golden Age. He died as he had lived, in fire, blood, and defiance. The fall of Blackbeard at Ocracoke did not end with his body collapsing on the deck. It marked the beginning of his transformation into enduring myth. The ferocity of his final stand was recounted with awe and fear alike, retold in taverns, courtrooms, and colonial newspapers. To some, he was a monster finally slain. To others, he was a symbol of freedom crushed beneath the weight of empire. Either way, his death was more than the loss of a man. It was the birth of a legend. Lieutenant Robert Maynard, bloodied but victorious, severed Blackbeard's head and mounted it on the bowsprit of his sloop. It was a gruesome display, yet one demanded by the Crown. In Virginia, the head was fixed to a pole at Hampton River, where it remained for years as a warning to others who might be tempted by piracy. The sight of the blackened skull, once framed by that infamous beard, was meant to terrify. Instead, it also enthralled, drawing crowds who whispered tales of the man who had once made the world tremble. His body, dumped into the waters of Ocracoke, gave rise to still more legends. Sailors swore they saw it swim around Maynard's ship 3 times before sinking, as though even death could not restrain him. Some claimed that on moonlit nights, the headless figure could be seen pacing the shoreline, searching for its missing head. Others whispered that strange lights glowed beneath the waves, where his corpse had fallen, a ghostly marker of the pirate's grave. Colonial authorities rejoiced at his demise, declaring that commerce was safe once more. Governor Spotswood, who had orchestrated the hunt, sent triumphant reports to London. Yet even in victory there was unease. Blackbeard's legend had grown too vast to be silenced by death. For every colonist who celebrated another, quietly admired the audacity of the man who had defied kings and governors, living and dying by his own rules. Among pirates, his fall struck hard. Some crews surrendered soon after, shaken by the ferocity of Maynard's attack. Others swore vengeance, claiming that Blackbeard's spirit guided them still. In Nassau and Tortuga toasts were raised to his memory, and tales of his final battle grew ever more exaggerated. Some said he fought on after being shot 10 times. Others that he killed a dozen men single-handedly before falling. Each retelling made him larger, less a man than a force of nature cut down by treachery. The legend spread far beyond the Americas. In England, pamphlets circulated describing his death in lurid detail. Ballads were sung about the devil-bearded pirate whose ferocity defied even death itself. For those who never saw the Atlantic, Blackbeard became the embodiment of piracy, a figure who would endure in folklore long after lesser names were forgotten. His death was paradoxically his greatest triumph. No mere execution or capture could have carried the same weight. By fighting to his last breath, by falling only under a storm of bullets and blades, he guaranteed that his name would never die. Blackbeard the man was gone, but Blackbeard the legend had only just begun to haunt the seas. The death of Blackbeard in 1718 did not merely close the chapter on one man's life. It signalled the beginning of the end for an entire era. His fall came at a time when the golden age of piracy was already under siege. With London and colonial governors finally committed to stamping out the outlaw fleets, the tide turned swiftly against those who had once ruled the seas. Benjamin Hornigold, the mentor who had given Blackbeard his first command, accepted the king's pardon and turned hunter, capturing his former brethren in the name of law. Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, tried to continue his career, but lacked the cunning and ferocity to survive. Captured in South Carolina, he was hanged in December 1718, his genteel origins offering no protection against the gallows. Other captains, Charles Vane Calico, Jack Rackham, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, would each meet their own fates in the years to come, some swinging from the noose, others fading into obscurity. The colonies that had once tolerated or even profited from pirates could no longer afford their presence. Governors like Woodes Rogers in the Bahamas waged relentless campaigns, driving the outlaws from their havens. The makeshift pirate Republic of Nassau collapsed its taverns, emptied its black flags, struck down. Where once hundreds of freebooters had gathered, only the watchful eyes of the crown remained. Yet while the empire claimed victory, the memory of the pirates proved harder to bury. Their downfall was swift, but their stories endured. Blackbeard's death in particular became the defining tale, the yardstick by which all other pirate legends were measured. No blockade, no gallows, no proclamation could erase the image of the bearded devil who had once held entire colonies hostage. In the aftermath, sailors and settlers alike debated what the pirates truly represented. To some, they were little more than thieves, violent men who preyed on honest commerce and deserved the hangman's rope. To others, they symbolized defiance, a wild freedom in the face of empire, a reminder that even kings could not fully control the seas. This tension would shape how their memory was carried forward, transforming them from criminals into icons. The fall of Blackbeard marked the high watermark of piracy, but also its decline. Without him, the fractured brotherhood of the coast lost its most terrifying champion. Yet even as the Golden Age ended, the world refused to let go of its fascination. Pirates might be hunted, captured, and executed, but their stories of daring raids, hidden treasure, and fire-lit beards would live on, growing taller with each retelling. And in that sense, Blackbeard's death did not end his reign. It simply shifted it from reality into legend, where it would endure long after the last pirate ship struck its colours. Blackbeard's death, marked the decline of piracy. In the Atlantic, it is important to remember that he was part of a much larger network, a sprawling informal confederacy that linked the seas of Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Pirates of the early 18th century were not isolated raiders, but participants in a global system, one that challenged empires by exploiting their weaknesses and turning their own trade routes against them. The so-called Pirate Round exemplified this system. Sailors from Europe and the Americas sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, raiding the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. Madagascar became a notorious base, a halfway point where ships could rest, resupply, and divide their plunder. Pirates who once haunted the Caribbean appeared in the waters off Africa and Asia, striking at the Mughal Empire's treasure fleets and disrupting the spice trade. Some even dreamed of founding permanent pirate kingdoms free from European control. In the Caribbean and American colonies, similar patterns emerged. Nassau, Tortuga, and Port Royal were not just havens, but nodes in a transatlantic web. Goods stolen in one hemisphere could be sold in another, laundered through corrupt merchants who cared little for legality as long as profit was assured. African ports too played their part, as pirates seized slaving vessels or traded directly for supplies. The Confederacy was not formalized, but it thrived on shared codes, mutual alliances, and the constant circulation of men, ships, and stories. Blackbeard's career intersected with this wider world at many points. His early years as a privateer likely took him across the Atlantic, perhaps even toward the coast of Africa. His capture of La Concorde, a French slave ship, tied his story directly to the brutal transatlantic slave trade. and his dealings in the Caribbean connected him to merchants, smugglers and settlers who formed the shadow economy that piracy made possible. This confederacy also explains the persistence of pirate legends. Stories spread not only through survivors' testimonies, but through the networks of sailors who carried news from one port to another. A tale whispered in a Jamaican tavern might be retold months later in London or Amsterdam, embroidered with each telling. In this way, Blackbeard's exploits, like those of Bartholomew Roberts or Henry Every, before him, became part of a shared mythology that spanned oceans. Yet the same forces that made piracy global also ensured its downfall. As empires strengthened their navies and coordinated their campaigns, the pirate confederacy found itself squeezed from every direction. The dream of a self-sustaining outlaw republic, independent of kings and governors, withered under the relentless pressure of empire. Still, for a brief moment, men like Blackbeard belonged to something larger than themselves, a fraternity of outlaws who dared to defy the world's greatest powers. Their republic was built not on land, but on the shifting tides, a fleeting experiment in freedom that vanished as quickly as it arose. And yet its spirit lived on in the stories of hidden harbours, secret alliances, and brotherhoods bound not by nations but by the black flag. If Blackbeard's death ended his reign upon the seas, it also unleashed centuries of speculation about what he may have left behind. For no pirate legend would be complete without whispers of hidden treasure, and in Blackbeard's case, these tales have proven irresistible. Almost from the moment his body sank beneath the waters of Ocracoke, stories began to circulate that he had buried vast hoards of gold, silver, and jewels along the Carolina coast. Some claimed that he had secreted away chests of plunder in the marshes and barrier islands, marking the spots with cryptic symbols carved into trees. Others swore that he entrusted maps to a handful of loyal men only to have them killed so that the secret would die with him. One enduring legend insists that Blackbeard once boasted, "Only I and the devil know where my treasure is hidden, and the longest liver will have it." The line, whether authentic or invented, cemented the idea that his wealth was protected by more than just secrecy. It was bound up with dark pacts and curses. Treasure hunters, through the centuries, have searched tirelessly for these fabled hoards. From the outer banks of North Carolina to the sandy inlets of Virginia and the islands of the Caribbean, countless expeditions have sought Blackbeard's gold. None have ever produced definitive proof, yet the legends endure, fueling both local folklore and modern treasure-hunting fantasies. Part of the mystery lies in the nature of piracy itself. Pirates rarely hoarded wealth in the romantic fashion of chests buried on deserted islands. Instead, they spent their spoils quickly on rum women and the fleeting pleasures of freedom. Yet even this practical truth has not quenched the allure of Blackbeard's hidden riches. The absence of evidence only deepened the myth, for what is unseen is often more captivating than what is known. Some tales link his treasure to the wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge, suggesting that he deliberately sank her to hide untold wealth in her hold. Others speak of enchanted caves that can only be opened on certain nights when the tide is low and the moonlight strikes just so. A few even claim that Blackbeard's ghost guards the riches, his headless form stalking the shorelines to drive seekers away. Though no treasure has ever been found, the myth itself is priceless. It has kept Blackbeard alive in the imagination, transforming him from a pirate into an eternal puzzle. Gold and silver may tarnish, but the promise of a secret fortune waiting just beyond reach ensures that his legend never fades. In the end, the greatest treasure Blackbeard left behind was not buried in the earth, but in the minds of those who came after him. A story so rich that it continues to lure dreamers, writers, and adventurers centuries later. Though Blackbeard's body was cast into the waters of Ocracoke, his legend refused to sink with it. In the decades that followed, he rose again, not in flesh, but in story, ballad, and printed word. The 18th and 19th centuries saw a resurrection of his image, reshaping him from a feared criminal into a figure of fascination, even romance. Early on, colonial pamphlets sensationalized his life and death. Accounts of his ferocity, his demonic appearance, and his violent end at Ocracoke were eagerly consumed by readers in England and the colonies. He was described alternately as a monstrous villain and as a daring adventurer who defied the might of empire. These contradictions only deepened his allure. By the late 18th century, pirates as a whole began to shift in the public imagination. No longer just criminals, they were seen as rebellious spirits, symbols of resistance against authority. In this new vision, Blackbeard stood foremost. He became the archetype of the pirate captain, his burning beard and fearsome eyes etched into popular memory. Ballads were sung in taverns, plays dramatized his exploits, and writers found in him a ready-made hero or villain for their tales. The 19th century cemented this transformation. Romanticism, with its fascination for wild freedom and untamed nature, embraced the pirate as a symbol of defiance. Writers painted Blackbeard as a Byronic figure, dark, brooding, larger than life. His violence was softened, his cruelty reimagined as flamboyant bravado. He was no longer simply a thief, but an outlaw king, roaming the seas with reckless grandeur. Illustrations and novels of the period gave him form. Artists depicted him towering over terrified sailors, pistols bristling from his sash smoke, curling from his beard. Children read of him in adventure stories, where treasure maps and hidden islands carried the promise of wonder. The grim reality of piracy, the blood, the slavery, the desperation, was pushed aside in favour of spectacle. Blackbeard, once a terror, had become entertainment. This cultural resurrection ensured that he would never fade into obscurity. Where other pirates were forgotten, his name endured. He was invoked not only as history but as legend, a figure who could be moulded to fit the desires of each age. To moralists, he was a warning. To romantics, he was a symbol of freedom. To children, he was the embodiment of adventure. And so Blackbeard lived on his story, reshaped, with each telling his image, resurrected, whenever the world longed for tales of the sea. Though centuries had passed since his death, the fire in his beard still burned in the imagination of all who heard his name. By the 20th century, Blackbeard had crossed fully from history into myth. No longer confined to dusty pamphlets or colonial records, he became a cultural icon, a character woven into novels, films, and eventually the vast machinery of popular entertainment. His image, towering bearded eyes blazing from a smoky haze, was now as recognizable as any king or conqueror. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, 1883, did not name Blackbeard directly, but its infamous Long John Silver and the very idea of buried pirate treasure drew heavily from the legends that had grown around him. In Stevenson's pages, the pirate became the template for every swashbuckling rogue that followed, cunning, dangerous, yet strangely charismatic. From then on, Blackbeard's shadow hung over every fictional corsair. Hollywood embraced him next. In mid-20th century films, he appeared alternately as a brutal villain and a comedic figure, his beard bristling as he swaggered across the screen. Walt Disney even produced Blackbeard's Ghost 1968, a family comedy that turned the pirate into a bumbling spectral trickster. The fearsome demon of the 18th century had become light-hearted entertainment proof of how far myth had softened his image. Yet darker portrayals persisted. Television series and novels revisited his story with grit and brutality, painting him as a ruthless warlord of the sea. Documentaries sought to separate fact from legend, combing through colonial archives and archaeological evidence from the wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge. Each discovery anchors canon's tools, reminded audiences that behind the stories stood a real man whose shadow still haunted the Carolina coast. Perhaps the most dramatic revival came with the blockbuster Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. In its fourth installment, On Stranger Tides, 2011, Blackbeard was reimagined as a sorcerer pirate master of dark powers, his ship alive with supernatural menace. Though fantastical, the portrayal reflected how inseparable myth and reality had become. The historical Edward Teach was long gone, but Blackbeard, the legend, part man, part devil, part ghost, remained endlessly adaptable. His name now appears in everything from video games to comic books, theme park rides, to children's cartoons. He is a villain, a hero, a joke, a nightmare all at once. The malleability of his legend ensures its survival. Where history is fixed, myth evolves, and Blackbeard has become a myth flexible enough to meet every generation's desires. This modern myth-making has ensured that Edward Teach, a man who lived and died within scarcely 40 years, will outlive entire empires. His beard still smoulders in the imagination, whether as a figure of terror or a ghostly companion of laughter. In life he sought to terrify. In death he became immortal. More than 3 centuries have passed since Edward Teach's headless body sank into the waters of Ocracoke, yet his shadow still stretches across the Atlantic world. Few figures of the golden age of piracy have endured so vividly in the human imagination. Others were as wealthy, some even more successful, but none captured the balance of fear and fascination that Blackbeard commanded. His legacy is not merely historical, it is cultural, psychological, and enduring. For historians, Blackbeard remains both a puzzle and a symbol. The records of his life are fragmentary, scattered among court testimonies, colonial letters, and sensational pamphlets. Sorting fact from myth is a constant challenge. Did he truly light fuses in his beard during battle? Did he bury treasure in the Carolina marshes, guarded by curses and spells? Was he a brutal sadist or a cunning tactician who used fear to minimize bloodshed? The truth likely lies somewhere in between, yet the ambiguity itself is part of his power. Archaeology has added new dimensions to the story. The discovery of the wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge in 1996 off the coast of Beaufort, North Carolina, revealed tangible remnants of his rain cannons, medical tools, navigational instruments, even fragments of gold. Each artifact bridged the gap between myth and reality, reminding the world that behind the legend was a living, breathing man who commanded ships, fought battles, and met his end in a fury of smoke and steel. But the deeper legacy lies in culture. Blackbeard embodies the contradictions of piracy itself. He was ruthless yet admired. He was a criminal yet celebrated. To empires, he was a plague to be eradicated. To storytellers, he became a canvas upon which every age could paint its fears and fantasies. In the 18th century, he was a warning against lawlessness. In the 19th, he was romanticized as a dark rebel. In the 20th and 21st, he became entertainment, sometimes terrifying, sometimes comedic, always captivating. Legends continue to evolve. Some say his ghost still wanders the Outer Banks, searching for his head. Others claim to hear cannon fire echoing across the water on stormy nights, as if the final battle at Ocracoke plays itself out again and again. Treasure hunters still scour the Carolina coast, convinced that somewhere beneath the sand lies a chest of Blackbeard's gold, waiting for the longest liver to claim it. In truth, his greatest treasure is the myth itself. Edward Teach, a man who likely sought wealth, power, and survival, like any sailor of his age, became Blackbeard, a figure who transcends history. His name is now shorthand for piracy, his beard an icon, his legend immortal. Blackbeard's story is more than a tale of plunder and battle. It is a reminder of how fear shapes power, how stories outlast empires, and how a man can, by will and theatre, turn himself into a myth. In the end, Edward Teach died, but Blackbeard, the devil of the seas, the ghost in the smoke, sails on forever.